Kevin said, my name is Brian Prestia. I'm the founder of Reason Test Prep. Let me give you just a little bit of background about myself. I've been doing GMAT, GRE, SAT, and ACT tutoring since 2003. I do, we do all four tests, but I personally do mostly the GMAT, mostly GMAT and GRE, but I'd say GMAT predominantly. I've also been doing online tutoring for a long time now, even pre-COVID, since about 2011, 2012, and probably starting around 2016 or so, I was really predominantly online. And then starting, once COVID hit, then I was, fully online, but I've been doing, mostly online tutoring for many years now. Our emphasis at Reason Test Prep is on reasoning and critical thinking. I think that's one thing that sets us apart. It's important on all four of those tests, GMAT, GRE, SAT, and ACT, but it's probably most important on the GMAT and the GRE. They are, reasoning tests. So we'll talk about this more, or I'll talk about it, but these subsections within the GMAT and the GRE, they're called the quantitative reasoning section and the verbal reasoning section. So it's, it's a reasoning test, and that's the most important aspect of it. So that's what we emphasize. We have helped hundreds of students get into top 10 MBA programs. I'd say most of the people that come to us are aiming for top 10 schools, even top 5. I mean, Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, Columbia, schools like that. That's kind of the world in which we operate. A lot of private equity people and investment banking and things like that, consulting. Okay, so let me just give an overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. Who takes the GMAT, the GRE, and why? Just discuss the two tests and what they're for, and why you would take one versus the other. Similarities and differences between the GMAT and the GRE. How to decide which test to take. We'll talk a lot about that. How to prepare for the tests. I won't go into a ton of detail there, but just some general advice to get people started, and then Q&A at the end, where I'm happy to answer any questions. Okay, so who takes the GMAT or the GRE, and why? So the GMAT is traditionally the business school test. I mean, it was designed specifically for that, whereas the GRE is for all types of graduate school, including business school. That really started in 2011. The GRE was overhauled in 2011 and really made more like the GMAT. It wasn't as much like the GMAT, and they basically changed it, and ETS changed it and made it much more like the GMAT, made the quant harder, really transformed the test pretty drastically. And part of the idea was to get business schools to start accepting the GRE as an alternative to the GMAT, and it worked, because soon after that, schools started accepting it. And now I think pretty much all schools, certainly all the top schools, all the schools I know of, will take the GRE in lieu of the GMAT. It's also, traditionally the GRE was just the graduate test for everything but law school, business school, and medical school. But it's now obviously accepted at business school. It's also accepted by most law schools too. A lot of the top law, or most of the top law schools. So it's actually good for that too. And then, the medical school is just the MCAT, as far as I know. So, but anyway, it doesn't mean, that you should just take the GMAT because it's business school. We'll talk more about this, and how to decide which test to take. One thing I want to just clear out right off the bat is that, people tend to say, okay, well, the GMAT is a business school test, you should just take that. There's some truth to that, but that's maybe a minimal thing at best, basically. I'll explain more about that. And then there's also a reverse myth that maybe the GRE is the better test to take. So let me just kind of dive into that in a little bit more detail. Basically, the GMAT is the business school admissions test. So the idea is, okay, well, you want to demonstrate that you're really committed to going to business school and nothing else. That's kind of the idea behind that. But there's a whole nother camp of people who will argue that, well, because business schools have to, report their, average or median GMAT score, but they don't have to with the GRE, then maybe like a GRE is a better test score to submit, because then, if it's not a great score, then schools, don't worry as much about it. And basically, I'll probably elaborate on this more, but just in a nutshell, if you talk to admissions consultants, people who have been on the inside at business schools, the way it's framed is this, is that if you're really on the fence, you should take the GMAT. Again, I'll elaborate more on this in a bit, but if you're on the fence, take the GMAT, because it is the business school admissions test traditionally, and it is a way of just demonstrating that that's what you're committed to. If you submit a GRE score, it could be viewed as, well, maybe this person's not totally all in on business school. But that's if you're basically on the fence. There are reasons why it might be better to go for the GRE. Again, we'll talk more about it, but sort of idea is, okay, if you're really on the fence, just take the GMAT. And if that doesn't work out, then pivot to the GRE. And that's something actually, we do with a lot of our students is, if things aren't going well with the GMAT, we pivot to the GRE. Again, I'll explain a little bit more about that. Yeah, so another myth that I want to clear out is that a lot of people, come to us saying, oh, I just want to do the GRE. I've heard it's easier. Let me do that. And what I always say to this is that first of all, it's not really easier. The quantitative part is easier, but the verbal part is a little bit harder. That's one thing. But even for people who are, not quantitatively inclined and they want the easier quantitative section, at the end of the day, you're still competing against the same cohort of people, basically. So, if it's easier for you, then it's easier for them as well. And you still have to outperform those very same people. And there's a way to convert a GRE score to a GMAT score. So, yeah, it's got a calculator. Again, we'll talk more about this. The quantitative section is a bit easier, but you just can't get as many questions right. So yeah, at the end of the day, there's no way of getting around the fact that you have to outperform the very same people who are applying to that school. And it doesn't matter, if you take an easier test or a harder test, you're still on a level playing field against the people that you're up against. So, yeah, I'll talk more about this, but as I hinted at before, you could take both tests. They're very, very similar actually. So you don't want to go in being like, oh, I'll do them both, but it's certainly not that hard to pivot from one to the other. And I'll say more about that. Okay, so GMAT versus GRE, let's just talk about some similarities. So they both have quantitative and verbal reasoning sections, and they both have two essays on the GRE, one on the GMAT. They're both computer adaptive tests. They're adaptive in different ways. It's not so important for people to understand, people who are taking the test, but I'll mention something about that later. They both test pretty similar content knowledge, especially on the quantitative sections. It's almost exactly the same content basis. Actually, the GRE is a little more extensive. It covers a couple things that the GMAT doesn't cover, but more or less it's about 95% the same, really, in terms of the content that's covered. And then yeah, some question types are also the same. So on the quantitative sections, they both tests have problem solving questions. On the verbal, they both have reading comprehension, and they both have argument questions. They're called different things, but they're both basically the exact same thing. And then in terms of the differences, so there are some different quantitative question types. So the GMAT has data sufficiency and the GRE has quantitative comparisons. Those are actually still pretty similar question types because they both have a component of, do you have enough information to answer a question? But data sufficiency is definitely like a much harder, this is going to sound kind of denigrating to the GRE, but the quantitative comparisons are like a JV version of like data sufficiency. Data sufficiency is like the varsity version. And then verbal is actually where they're more different. The quant sections, again, are pretty similar. The biggest, probably the biggest difference is that the GRE has vocabulary-based questions. The GMAT does not. In place of that, the GMAT has grammar-based questions that the GRE does not have. So we'll talk more about this, but in terms of deciding which test to take, that could be a factor. Again, I kind of hinted at this. The GMAT has a slightly harder quantitative section. The GRE has a slightly harder verbal section, but really it's a slight difference. One note on this, because I might forget to mention this later, is I take these tests personally every once in a while. And the last GRE I took, I had already suspected this, but taking it really confirmed it. What you see in the released GRE materials is I think the quantitative questions don't reflect the actual difficulty of the test. Like they're not hard enough. And I had a feeling that was true, for a whole bunch of reasons, but retaking the GRE recently, it just confirmed that, yeah, like the questions are harder generally than what you see in the official released GRE questions. And one thing that's important if you're going to do GRE study is that you and take the GRE is that you use GMAT questions, because that was another big takeaway for me is doing the GRE quantitative sections and feeling like, man, it's a good thing I know the GMAT really well, because if you just only prepared on GRE questions, you really wouldn't be that well prepared for this. Whereas if you've done a significant number of GMAT questions, which is what we recommend with our students, then you're much more prepared for the harder things that you actually see on the GRE. You do have a calculator on the GRE. That's another bonus for a lot of people. Again, though, everyone has a calculator, so it's not really an advantage. It's a level playing field. But if you're someone who just can't function without a calculator, well then GRE might be a better choice for you. And then I mentioned that they do have a slightly different algorithm on the computer adaptive nature of their tests. Really, there's not a whole lot that one who's going to be taking the GRE or GMAT needs to know about that. I would just say the GRE algorithm, there's almost nothing to know that would help you do better on it, really. Like it might be interesting to kind of know how it works, but it's not really going to help you perform any better or score any higher. Whereas I think on the GMAT, knowing how the algorithm works is important, because there's a way to definitely optimize the way you manage your time and where you try to spend that time on the GMAT. And so it really lends itself to strategy in a way that the GRE doesn't. So again, just if you're choosing between the two tests, if you are going to take the GMAT, you should learn as much as you can about the algorithm, because that definitely will be a factor. Okay, how to decide which test to take, GMAT or GRE? I mean, the first thing is, are you certain you want business school? I would say if you're 90% plus sure that you want to go to business school, then that's great. Then perhaps you take the GMAT. I mean, this is just my personal opinion, but I think if you're less than 90% sure, or maybe less than 80% sure, then if you're taking the GMAT and spending a ton of time and a ton of effort and a ton of money maybe on tutoring or whatever, then you might not be a good idea to take GMAT, because you're boxing yourself in. And if you change your mind and you decide you want to get a master's in journalism or something, well, now you got to take the GRE. So that's the first thing is, how certain are you that you want to go to business school? Second thing is, I recommend taking an official diagnostic. Don't take, a Princeton Review one or something like that. Take an official one, MBA.com for the GMAT, ATS.com for the GRE. And then, that will give you an idea of what the tests are like. And then, it's not just about comparing the scores. It's also about comparing, I'm probably blocking a little bit of the text here with this window. I don't know if you guys can see it, but anyway, don't just compare the scores. Also, think about the differences between the tests, because, you might do better on the GMAT at first, but the difference might be slight, and you might feel like with practice, maybe the GRE would be a better test ultimately. So for example, I mentioned the vocabulary versus grammar. You might just not be up on your vocabulary, and that's a reason why you missed a lot of questions, but you might view that as an easier thing to study. Like, okay, I'm very good at memorization. I'm just going to memorize, 1,000 words. Well, if that's something you could do, then that might be advantageous, and might be harder to do well on GMAT grammar-based questions, because it's a little bit harder to just like memorize rules. There's really much more of a reasoning element to that. So anyway, you don't want to just compare the scores. You really also want to think about the differences between the tests and how those play to your strengths and weaknesses. Okay, and then so I was saying this before. If you're on the fence and you're applying to business school, then take the GMAT. As I said, slight advantage to the GMAT in terms of what business schools want to see. Again, this all comes through, people I know who are admissions consultants who have worked in admissions offices and the kinds of feedback I get. It's also from students that I've personally had who have applied with GMAT, applied with GRE, and we've gotten kind of mixed feedback, honestly, from business schools about, can you submit a GMAT score instead of a GRE score, or things like that. But basically, again, it's probably the case that business schools have a slight preference maybe for a GMAT score. So if you're absolutely on the fence, I'd probably lean towards the GMAT. The other factor that I don't think I mentioned is that it's easier to go from the GMAT to the GRE. It's harder, I think, to go from the GRE to the GMAT. I've had actually a lot of success personally with people who came in starting with the GMAT, and after actually just in the past year, I've personally had 3 or 4 students who, I helped them decide to take the GMAT. It seemed like that was the right choice from the beginning. They weren't quite getting the scores they wanted, and we pivoted to the GRE, and they ended up getting great, really, in all the cases in the past year for me. They all ended up with great GRE scores, and you could look at that and be like, well, like what ways they should have prepared for the GRE, but I think that because they prepared for the GMAT is part of why they did so well in the GRE. So it's a lot easier to go GMAT to the GRE. I've had less success taking GRE people and pivoting to the GMAT. Okay, just a bit on how to prepare for the test. This will be kind of general. So first there are live courses. You could do these in person or online. All the major test prep companies, Manhattan Prep, Kaplan, Princeton Review have this. That's one option. I personally don't think those are the best options because I've taught many of these classes over the years, and it's very hard when you have people at varying levels. You have to sort of play to the middle. You can never really quite satisfy everyone in the class. So I think that's part of the problem, but it provides a good structure for people who want that. There's also on-demand courses like Magoosh. Target Test Prep is another newer one that's quite good, especially for quant. Manhattan Prep is another. I think this is a little bit better in a way because you can really go at your own pace, although you have a little bit less to keep you on track because you're really doing it on your own. So if you're someone who needs a scheduled class each week, then maybe that's not the best option. Private tutoring is probably the most expensive option, but obviously you're getting things handcrafted for you, and that's what we do. It's just private tutoring. It's possible to self-study. There's books and other resources. I think I'm going to mention in the next one. Yeah, so I guess other resources, one thing I'd say is forums. GMAT Club is a great resource. I've posted on there periodically. I know other tutors who post on there, and it's a lot of good information. It's a ton of information. You can easily spend weeks and weeks digesting all that's on there, but that's a fantastic resource. And that gives a lot of guidance too on how to self-study. So, and even would point to books, but you definitely want to use official materials as much as you can. I think I say that on the next thing. So other study tips. First of all, you should have a realistic timeline. If you're in school, if you're in college still, junior or senior in college, and when you're going to have finals and things like that, you should plan for that. I've tutored people who are seniors in college, and I've made this mistake a couple of times, and I've learned from it. But we aim for a test date in May of their senior year, or something like that, and things just get crazy. They're graduating, and there's parties and stuff like that, and things just kind of fall apart. So that's not a great timeline to have. If you're in a type of work environment where when things are going to get busy or not busy, again, you want to try to plan that in, because having an interference where you have to kind of step away for a month or 6 weeks, it definitely is very, very wasteful to do that. You spend a lot of time kind of climbing back up. So, and the thing about retakes is most people take these tests, at least in my world, most people take the test average 3 times probably. I mean, definitely we tutor people who take it 4 times, 5 times. There's a 5-time limit for both tests in a rolling 12-month period. But yeah, you want to plan for that in your timeline as well, because in both cases, there's a waiting, both GMAT and GRE, there's a waiting period between tests, so you can't take it 2 days later. There's a loophole in the GMAT where there's a way to kind of do that, but for the GRE, there isn't. It's a 3-week wait, basically. So yeah, you got to figure that whenever you're going to take the test the first time, expect that you're going to take it again, and then again, and that might extend the process for another, month or 2, or longer even. Get help early. This is another thing. People, come to us all the time. Just over the years, I've had this happen countless times where someone tries to self-study, spends, a ton of effort, and I have a meeting with them, and they're like, man, like I literally spent 100 hours or 200 hours prepping, and man, I was doing so many things wrong. If I just like gotten some advice in the very beginning, then everything following that would have been much more effective. So yeah, so even if you're not looking for every week tutoring or something like that, it's good to get help early on, so that at the very least you can craft a plan and have the right mentality about how to go about preparing for the tests. Yeah, I mentioned this before, but you might need unofficial resources in order to learn some of the math foundation and things like that. But you should, for the questions in the test, it's really good to rely on official questions, official tests. This is another thing that people don't understand. So I actually had a call with someone today who is, been preparing for the GRE with Princeton Review. Hate to pick on Princeton Review, but they're just not the best when it comes to GMAT and GRE prep. And so, she's doing all these practice questions and practice tests, and some of that material is just not very accurate. So when it comes to the questions and the test, best to try to stick with official stuff. And when it comes to the GMAT, there's a ton of official released questions. So you almost never run out of official questions for the GMAT. The GRE is like literally 1/10 of the material, so it's much, much smaller. But again, if you're preparing for the GRE, you should be using GMAT quantitative questions, at least partly. So then you have another resource that is good for doing quantitative practice. Not as much, you don't have as much on the verbal side, unfortunately. And then, yeah, I mean, remember that you're studying for taking a reasoning test. This is another, this is my like greatest hits of like what people regret when they come to me, having not had any guidance, is I'd say almost everyone gets the wrong idea and thinks it's a math test or a grammar test or a vocabulary test in the case of the GRE, and it's not. Both tests are reasoning tests, and that's how you need to approach it. So it's not it's not just applying pure math or pure verbal, pure grammar knowledge. It's logical reasoning and problem solving and critical thinking, and those are the things that really matter most. So yes, it's important to have the sort of content foundation for the quantitative and verbal sections of the test, but that's not enough. And frankly, you probably could get by, depending on the score you want, with just great reasoning and problem solving and not knowing a lot of the underlying content. I mean, honestly, that describes me the first time I took the GRE and the GMAT. So, okay. And then the last thing is, be your own tutor. So you don't want to just go through, even people that we tutor suffer from this. I mean, they have a tutor, but especially if you're on your own, you can't just go through the motions and be like, all right, I'm going to just bang out, 100 questions. You really have to be very thoughtful about, why you're getting questions wrong. Why are you guessing? Like, right, you might be getting a question right, but if you're guessing, then you should ask yourself why it wasn't more clear, why, choice A was right and choice B was wrong. So you really want to be your own tutor, be your own coach, and really be very deliberate and thoughtful at least as you review questions. Don't just kind of bang out a million questions. You've got to really ask yourself what you need to be doing differently. There's a limit to how much anyone can figure that out on their own, right? That's why even professional tennis players have coaches. They might be the best tennis player in the world, but they can't always see things that are happening inside themselves. So that's where you're going to be a little bit limited in what you can do, but there's definitely a difference between just banging through a million questions and really being very thoughtful about what's going wrong, what you can change, and being very deliberate about trying to make those changes. Resource for more information. I mentioned GMAT Club before. That I think is the best resource all around. Poets and Quants is great for business schools and learning more about business schools. Also, admissions consultants. There's a lot of information about different admissions consultants on Poets and Quants. So that's a great resource. Admissions consultants themselves are a great resource. So we really just do the tests. We don't do any. We're not involved in any kind of admission consulting. you know, I personally know a lot, having tutored hundreds of people, and, you know, seen them go through the process. But admissions consultants are another good resource for help on the, you know, application process. I'm here to help. That's my email address right there. And yeah, I think that really wraps it. Kevin, I don't know if